Architectural Artcast.
When it comes to the Fallout series, a lot of people, myself included, would argue that New Vegas is the best at world building. And no, I'm not including Fallout 1 and 2 in this analysis. Those are their own separate thing. Part of the appeal of New Vegas is the story takes you on a road trip where you get to explore what remains of the Mojave. There are two aspects as to why so many people find a road trip across rural America so appealing. The first aspect goes back to rural architecture's emphasis on their unique place. Roadside architecture exaggerates this with the goal of trying to get you to stop your car, get out, and take a closer look, with the ultimate goal of trying to convince you to part with some of your money. Everybody and their brother knows what's going on here. That's why we call them tourist traps. But why do they work? Why are people willing to stop at so many of these spots, willing to put themselves in a position to where they might be willing to part with some of their money? This gets back to the second issue that was addressed by the famed architect Robert Venturi in his seminal work, Learning from Las Vegas. Once you get past the pretentious, overly complicated language, he explains why some roadside architecture we're willing to go miles out of our way to see, while others fail. It all goes back to met expectations. People like staying at motels that have rooms that look like giant teepees because the outside of the architecture looks like a giant teepee. When they go into the room, they realize they're inside a giant teepee. When we encounter architecture, particularly something unexpected or unusual, it causes us to have expectations, which leads to anticipation. When our experiences of that architecture fulfill those expectations, we like it. Pressure and release. Human beings are pretty simple. When we experience an architecture that doesn't fulfill our expectations, we don't like it, sometimes to the point of open hostility. We see all of this play out in New Vegas. When we first get to Novac, we encounter the Dino Hotel, and we see the giant dinosaur. We immediately stop and take a second look. We're drawn to it. It's doing its job. It's telling us, come over here. There's something important going on over here. You need to check this out. Once we go into the Dino Hotel, we discover all sorts of story elements. It was a good idea to check this place out. So again, the dinosaur did its job attracting us over. But as far as the dinosaur itself, if you examine it, you discover you can go into it. You can even climb up into its mouth and look out over the landscape. The dinosaur got our attention. We were able to interact with it, go in it, go on it, so that when we left, we had a sense of fulfillment. We enjoyed our experience. Contrast that with our encounter with the statues at the Mojave Outpost. You can see these things for miles as you approach, clearly indicating, hey, something important over here, you need to check this out, similar to the Dino Motel. However, your encounter with the giant statues is very different than the one you had at the Dino Motel. Your experience feels hollow, because in this case, the statues are literally hollow. Once you see what the statues are, there's nothing left to do. You end up feeling tricked, lured, betrayed. You end up walking away with a sense of anger. The statues end up being nothing more than another sign. This case, advertising the Mojave Outpost. That's why every time our journey takes us back through Novac, we slow down so we can take a long, leisurely look at the dino, see if somebody's in his mouth. In my case, always makes me smile because it reminds me of how us kids would con my parents into stopping at every single tourist trap on our family road trips. Fine, we'll stop, but we aren't spending any money. Whereas, every time you return to the Mojave Outpost, you barely give the giant statues a second glance. Have to take a moment here and address the elephant in the room. One of the most fundamental flaws in all of the Fallout games. the condition of the world as we find it. Fallouts 3, 4, and New Vegas all take place roughly 200 years after the bombs fell. Yet, the world that we find is frozen in time as if the bombs had fallen just yesterday. It's perfectly believable that buildings that have been continually used, thus maintained, could last for 200 years or more because they do. Things, particularly metal things that have been abandoned out in the weather, don't last 200 years. The problem isn't just all the abandoned vehicles, which on a side note, if this is an inhabited community, why did they leave the vehicles just sitting in the middle of the road? You would not have abandoned metal buildings still standing after 200 years, especially ones with such precarious structures. If nothing else, as the structure weakened over time, eventually you'd have a gust of wind come along that was strong enough to toss that overhang like a giant frisbee. Wood structures don't decay like this. So the question is, how did this come about in the first place? If it's a result of a bomb blast, 2x4s don't survive in desert heat for 20 years, much less 200. And if it's a result of scavenging, why didn't they scavenge the 2x4s? A further question I have, to be honest, it's one of my pet peeves in all of Fallout. Where's everybody getting all of this plywood? Because it's not going to last 200 years, especially if it's left outside. And we're supposed to believe a mailbox lasts for 200 years sitting on a wood post? Yeah, right. Even the aluminum trailers shouldn't still exist. It is true aluminum doesn't rust, but it decays. It's much closer a process to rot. Eventually, it would collapse under its own weight, becoming nothing more than a pile of fragments and dust. Even the concrete modernist buildings wouldn't survive 200 years. Even in the desert, you have freeze-thaw cycle, which will cause the concrete to crack, eventually allowing moisture in, which would rust the rebar, causing the concrete to lose its ability to resist tension. Eventually, the concrete would collapse under its own weight. It doesn't take 200 years for this process to happen. This is the exact reason why, on average, most modernist buildings don't last 50 years. The closest that Fallout gets to accurately portraying structural decay is their brick and stone buildings. Because they're made out of little bitty pieces, they tend to fall apart as those little bitty pieces gradually wear away. And those electric poles surviving 200 years? The reality is that most of the buildings in the Fallout world should be little more than vegetation and dust-covered mounds. But what's the fun in that? Bethesda and Oblivion sacrificed realism for narrative and gameplay. The player gets a sense of the world that was lost as they explore interesting and fun locations. This compromise comes at a huge cost. It completely breaks the world building because it requires the player to completely suspend their disbelief. Because the moment you start to think about any of it, you realize this world can't exist as shown. A common mistake a lot of world builders make is they become so excited to show off their architecture and their design aesthetic, like Fallout's 1950 futuristic sci-fi theme, they forget that this would not be the only architecture in their world. While New Vegas's world building isn't perfect by any stretch, its cause is helped a great deal by its location. Rural America. In the first town you encounter at the beginning of the game, some of the first buildings you encounter are an Old West general store and a 1930s roadhouse. Right off the bat, we have a layering of history. Two buildings side by side, one from the earlier settlement period and the other representing how society changed because of the development of the car. The Goodsprings schoolhouse further reinforces the layered history of rural America with a one-room schoolhouse. The various houses around town are reminiscent of a rural southwestern vernacular from roughly around 1900. The only reference to the famed Fallout aesthetic is the gas station to be found on the road outside of town. Oh yeah, we can't forget, never forget, the 1950s-esque streamlined trailers. Cause all small towns have people living in trailers, don't you know? Goodsprings, all of New Vegas for that matter, represents the reality of the built world. DC, Boston, New York, San Francisco, LA, they all might have the latest and greatest in architectural innovation, but that innovation is going to take time to trickle out slowly into the hinterlands. One of the main reasons for this is economics. Rural America, their buildings tend to last longer, tend to be used over a longer period of time. Main reason? They can't afford to replace them too often. Because buildings tend to last so long in rural towns, you will often find the town's history preserved in those buildings. Where you're most likely to begin to find more modern, more contemporary architecture beginning to filter into rural America is through economic buildings, specifically chains and franchises like gas stations, or through government buildings like highway patrol stations, or through institutions like prisons. Nobody is more excited to plop down the latest and greatest in architectural innovation in every nook and cranny than corporations, like a public utility. An important thing to remember is that architecture is symbolic. The architecture of rural America symbolizes uniqueness of place and the uniqueness of the individuals who live in that place. Whereas the architecture of governments, institutions, and corporations symbolizes authority, power, control, and conformity. We see the battle between these two ideologies being played out all across the landscape of New Vegas. Most people don't live in rural America. Most people have never even been to a small town, so they're forced to rely on a shared cultural memory of small town America, a memory to a large part we have Walt Disney to thank for. Now, to Walt's credit, this shared memory is mostly based upon his memories of growing up in a small town in Missouri. Walt's memories of Main Street, small town USA were inspired by a mixture of 2- and 3-story buildings from the 1890s. Remember how I said the architecture in small town America tends to last a long time? It just so happens that Walt's memories of small town America, which has affected a large percentage of the population's perception of what small town America is, has a great deal of overlap with what small town America continues to look like. It's a fascinating case of how people's perceptions and reality line up to an amazing degree for some really odd reasons. New Vegas leans into that shared memory of rural America. Las Vegas is made up of a mixture of late 19th and early 20th century 2- and 3-story buildings. Each building has a sense that it has its own story, its own history. Sprinkled in amongst the older historic architecture are the 1950s inspired modern buildings. These buildings clearly share the same design aesthetic as the buildings in Fallout 3, but they incorporate local building materials, in this case, brick. This is exactly how regional variations develop. Somebody wants the latest and greatest, but they have to use local building practices and materials. People start to like how that looks. They start to do it on purpose. We finally get to the Strip. The first time I played New Vegas and I got to the Strip, I was disappointed because chopping it up into 3 sections ruins the effect. Now, in Obsidian's defense, the technology at the time forced them to make that choice. And it's a shame because the Strip is really well done. I'd love to see a modern remaster so we could have the Strip in its full glory. Las Vegas in the 1950s was a small town, a little oasis in the desert, and the Strip was nothing like it has become today. Historically, casinos were the domain of the wealthy and elite. Think Rick's Place in Casablanca, where scions of privilege went to play. They would dress to the nines so they could eat the most luxurious meals, drink the most expensive booze, listen to the latest music, drop more than the average person made in a year at the tables just so they could laugh about it, and then spend the night in each other's arms. Casinos were temples to luxury, excess, and debauchery. The Las Vegas Strip of the 1950s was the last faded echoes of that era as it was slowly transitioning to whatever it's become today. The Vegas Strip is roadside architecture cranked up to 11, because not only are they trying to convince you to stop, take a second look, come on in so we can get as much of your money as possible, they're also trying to convince you not to go into the building next door. Casino architecture has no ambiguity. It tells you exactly what it's up to. It's trying to give you a hug, put its arm around your shoulder, guide you in, make you feel as welcome as possible. If one casino doesn't catch your interest, there's another one that's more than happy to provide whatever you want. Granted, it's scaled down like all video games, but New Vegas' Strip gives the feel of the 1950s Las Vegas Strip. It's ironic that the Lucky 38, the showpiece of the game itself, is the worst casino on the Strip. It's because it's much more akin to the statues outside the Mojave Outpost. The experience of interacting with the architecture has nothing to do with what it looks like. Having said that, and if you ignore all the outside stuff, the inside of the Lucky 38 really nails the 1950s Vegas vibe. You expect to see Dean Martin getting ready for his next set. It is really hard to recreate the unique sense of space of a famous place like Las Vegas. It's even harder to then try to make changes to that place and still maintain its unique sense of space. To its credit, and despite all its flaws, Fallout New Vegas manages to do exactly that. It creates a space that evokes the feeling of the 1950s Vegas Strip, but is also very different. At any rate, I hope I gave you all something to think about. And until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like the video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time. And feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.